Welcome to Revolutionary Gazette. I'm Will. This doesn't look like you often see us, and I'm with my friend Sean Considine. Well, with remotely. We'd rather be sitting together talking about this subject in the same room, but it's not to be. You've met Sean before, as you've seen us talk about living history aspects. Sean, it's obviously worth us getting together this way tonight. What are we talking about?
So we're talking about books, but more importantly, we're talking about rare books, and we're talking about first editions. And the one that we're specifically talking about this evening is The History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution by Mercy Otis Warren.
Tell me a little bit about this book, and tell me why you're involved with it.
Well, I'm going to answer your questions in reverse. Why I'm involved with it is I happen to own a set of these books. It is a 3-volume set that was published in 1805 for the first edition. Why else is it significant? Because while the books are pretty wonderful, I do collect rare books and books of the period. Unfortunately, I can't bring them into the camera right now because they're not with me. They're actually on loan to a brand new historical society, 501c, called the Mercy Otis Warren Society.
Well, let's take it from the beginning. Let's start with the books. There's 1,500 of the first printing. Tell me what the books are about.
So these are one of the real first histories of the American Revolution. Not only that, but they're quite different and they're quite significant for whom they're written by and how they are written. So first of all, they're written by Mercy Otis Warren, whose house in Plymouth was being used as a meeting site for the Sons of Liberty. Her and her family were active in the Patriot cause, and she herself was writing under pen names, usually signing as a lady, but she's writing satirical and critical plays and all sorts of other stuff that's getting published. So it's being written by someone who is active in the American Revolution at the time. It's being written by someone who goes and knows the material, who actually lived through it. So it's published in 1805, as I said, but she starts doing research on it many, many years before. The other thing that really makes it interesting is that although if you were to read it, it might not read exactly like you would think a modern scholarly history book or something like that. It's actually written in a very, what we would consider, modern way. It's not just someone writing their own thoughts or their own ideas, pontificating for pages on end. Mrs. Warren is actually going out. She's finding pamphlets. She's collecting interviews from people that were there at the time. So when she's putting her volumes together and her history together, it is very researched to the point that we would think of modern academic things. She has footnotes all throughout. She has all sorts of information of where she's getting her sources. So she's using primary sources like we would now. She's using secondary sources, and she's putting together this really profound, this really complex and nuanced history of the American Revolution.
So, Sean, you talk about Mercy using this very, what we might think of as a modern way. This isn't very common in the era?
So I wouldn't say it's uncommon. What the other person who does it that's very interesting, who Mrs. Warren actually has a correspondence with, is the famous English historian Catherine Macaulay. But the two of them kind of do things in a very similar way. Macaulay is writing about the English Civil War and the periods of James I, and she's going back. She's getting flyers from people who are collecting them. She's getting pamphlets. That way, she's seeing stuff like that. So Mrs. Warren is doing much of the same. What's really interesting is in 1791. Which is 3 months before Catherine Macaulay would die, Mercy and Catherine had developed quite a substantial correspondence going back and forth between the two of them. And 3 months before her death, Macaulay actually, in a letter, writes and says, your book of poems and your book of plays has just come. I'm really looking forward to going and getting them at the bookstore. But she also notes that she is very excited to read Mercy's history, because even at this point in 91, we know that she's writing it.
Great. And so these women have a relationship. Are they fairly unique in the way of authors in the early 19th century?
I wouldn't say that they're unique. I mean, there's lots of histories that are out there. What kind of makes them different in the way that they're writing is that neither of them really pull back any punches. Macaulay is kind of lambasted in Parliament for volumes 3 and 4 of her history. because she takes a very Republican stance. Meanwhile, Mrs. Warren, who is friends with people like John Adams and friends with people like the Knoxes, when she gets into her third volume and she starts talking about the Society of the Cincinnati, and she starts talking about what's going on after the revolution has ended, the termination and the epilogue part, she doesn't hold back any pet punches. She's very critical of John Adams. She's very critical of Washington. And Mrs. Warren is a very ardent Republican, and kind of is doesn't really hold back when it comes to talking about the Federalists. So it causes issues. Her and John Adams, who were friends and were correspondents for years, it almost ruins the friendship. Now they do eventually, make amends later in both of their lives, but there is a very, because of what she writes and because of how she writes it causes issues with relationships.
Well, let's use that as a way to turn, because let me say, you speak well of the book. If you've just received this, I have a feeling you've read the text before owning the originals.
I haven't read all of it. Admittedly, maybe I shouldn't say that on public. I've gone through most of it in bits and pieces. But as I said, it is rather substantial. The nice thing is although I'm not holding the books in front of me right now, you can find them online. You can buy reprints of them. So they are rather significant to go through, not only for history of the time from someone who experienced it, but also to understand the way that Mrs. Warren and those around her felt about what was going on during the Revolution.
Excellent. I've got to ask, before we go to any of the academic understandings, what's the difference? You've been able to look at your original volumes that you're the caretaker of, and you've read things, I assume, either on a Kindle or something like that. How does that experience differ?
First of all, the smell. You don't get the smell of an old book or any book in general when you're holding a screen. There's just something very, very special about that. But also there's the feel of the paper. There's the history of the volume itself, the little notes that people have written in there from previous owners. One of the greatest thing about my volumes is that there's little notes in here, and you can kind of tell who owned it. There's owners' names in there from previous people, where they've been. So the books themselves, although they tell the story of the American Revolution, what's in the books actually tells the story of their history and kind of how they came to be.
Fantastic. Well, they've been written, they've been published, they're in the wind. How does this set of 3 books find its way to you?
I've been on as most people who are collectors, you kind of just have your recurring searches and your things that you're looking for all the time.
Yep.
This volume happened to be on that list. And one night it was probably about 10:30 at night. I was going through my usual searches, and 2 volumes as one set came up on a search, and I looked at them and I thought, that can't be real. Then I looked at the price and I thought, that definitely can't be real. And I looked through them and I was like, okay, well, that is real. So a colleague of mine, it's 10:30 at night, and I just kind of sent over the listing, and I was like, do I go for it? It's 10:30 at night. What are you doing? Look, and admittedly, I'm just kind of looking at these and just thinking, oh, okay, is this real? So she's like, no, of course not. You're never going to find the third volume. The likelihood of ever finding that third one is so incredibly rare. And then I said what they were listed for, and I kind of said, maybe sleep on it. So that evening I said, okay, I committed myself, and I said, I'm going to sleep on it. And if they're still there in the morning, I still assess them to be of the same quality, pull the trigger, go for it. I would have loved to have actually slept on it, because I think I was awake pretty much all night thinking about it. And the little bit of sleep that I did get, I was, having like subconscious dreams about these volumes. So when I woke up rather early, I immediately pulled the trigger, and there's 2 of 3 that are in my hands, as it were.
All right. So what's the story to get the third to make the full set?
So that's even more funny, because that same day, I bought 2 of the 3 volumes, and I was looking around and thinking, okay, well, I'm never going to find the third one. happened to be searching around some places, doing a little bit of search terms here and there, and lo and behold, there is the third volume. Poorly listed, no images, but there it is. So I contacted the seller directly, got some more information, traded some emails back and forth, and in less than 12 hours from purchasing the other 2 volumes, I now had a complete set.
What's it like the first time all 3 of these are with you?
It's honestly surreal. As I said, each one of these books tells its own story. You could see that through what's been written in there, the handling of it, little highlights here and there. These are 3 volumes that probably never should have been put back together. But because someone cared enough, because someone actually went out and searched, you now have these 3 volumes that were scattered to the wind, that probably were discarded by someone based on where they came from, and now they're back together.
Well, Sean, you guys have welcomed me into your home for meals, and your living room would be a wonderful place for these books to be displayed. Let's talk a little bit further about where they went and why they went there.
So it's rather funny. That's the second part of the story, because I bought the 2 volumes, and I want to say probably my first thought was I just bought 2 volumes of a rare book that I thought I would never own. And the second thought was, well, what am I going to do with these? And it was near instantaneous that they look great in my parlor. I would love to handle them on a daily basis, but they're not doing any good if they're there. There's no real purpose for it. And it was near instantly that the decision was consciously made that they need to be used as an educational tool. So the Mercy Otis Warren Society, that's out of Plymouth, Mass, Mercy's place of residence, it was immediately decided that they would do a lot more good in the hands of this historical society, so that way they could use it as an educational tool. So immediately the decision was made to put these on permanent loan. Rather remarkable and maybe a little crazy at the time, but hey, they've made their debut. They've been out. They've actually been in the building. That is the Warren's house. It's now a very nice pizza place. I would suggest them. We've kind of given them the grand tour. They've been to her hometown. They've been to Plymouth. They've been in spots where they were written, which is, if you think holding them for the first time is surreal, that's even more surreal than that. It's this disbelief of, wow, these books, the ideas, the words that were on these pages, this is where they came into being. And now they're back.
Fantastic. Well, I know you and I have talked about this getting ready to record this episode. You talked about some things that you figured out by putting these books back together and looking just at the physical nature of them. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
There's definitely some things we can tell from a material culture standpoint. One of the things we've kind of had interesting things finding out is that there are indentations in the pages, and they're all in the same spot in all of the volumes. There's a couple prevailing thoughts. We think that may either be from the way that they were dried after they were printed, or possibly in the binding itself, both through talking to printers who do the heat trade in a historic manner, and also from talking from some historic bookbinders, we kind of have an idea. But it's interesting to see that all 3 of the volumes and other surviving volumes all have these same indentations in the exact same spot. So it's a rather interesting detail. But also, again, as I've said, the stuff that's written in there, you can see where they've been, the bookstores that they came from. A couple of them are in libraries, so you can see the library, the different schools and places that they've been. So it's been very cool to track them down and try to figure out who owned them and who had them at one point in time.
Are there any notes in there you're able to find what someone was studying previously? Has that drawn anything further for you?
No, I haven't found anything on that. Like, there's no earmarks or anything like that. There are definitely some little check marks and highlights on where people have found passages rather remarkable, mostly in the 3rd volume, and it's in a lot of the critical nature that Mrs. Warren has of the Federalists and the Society of the Cincinnati. And, once again, like I said, when she doesn't hold back any punches. Apparently, for some reason, whoever was reading it at some point in time found that very interesting. And then just kind of going through the names and figuring out who owned them at one point in time, try to track them down and figure out, kind of what happened to them and about their lives.
Have you found anything about where these books went around the country or around the world from that?
I know that one of them at one point in time was in Washington, D.C., and I know that because of the bookseller's name that was in there at one point in time. Other ones were up in Dartmouth.
Fantastic. Well, 3 books come back together as a set and now get given to a historical society to be loaned there to keep helping preserve and reinterpret history. As we bring it to an end, what last thoughts do you have about this, or what would you like to share with us about it?
If you get the chance to read, I would suggest reading them first of all. Take a look at them, really get an idea of the history of the magnum opus of Mrs. Warren. If you get the chance, take a look at her and her contemporaries. There are women telling history, women being there, women being significant to the time is not something that is new. There's a rather excellent book, I think, that just came out on the Blue Stockings that's worth taking a look at. But you really start seeing these webs between Mrs. Warren, between Catherine Macaulay, between a lot of these very significant women who are going out and they are making impacts at the time. Even though their names are being relearned today, that is not to say that women like Mrs. Warren were not significant in their time and should be studied now. Go and see something that's being done by the Mercy Otis Warren Society. You can give them a follow at Celebrate Mercy Otis Warren. They're doing a lot of really good work, and for a nonprofit organization that's been in existence for less than a year, I think we gave them a pretty good head start with the volumes. But also, it's through the work that they're doing themselves that's really causing them to excel.
I can say that you did. Well, Sean, thank you for bringing the story through the Gazette to everybody here. Look forward to actually being back with you face to face when we can talk about more interpretive things, but this story needs to be told, and thank you for what you've done with history. Well, thank you for spending your time with Revolutionary Gazette. We give a shout out to our growing patrons who have made this episode possible. There's a good connection to history here. It's through an original text, whether you hold the original or whether you read a reproduction of it. Mercy Otis Warren lived in the era, had thoughts. Give her story a read. Find a connection to the American Revolution. We'll see you next time.